Greetings, God's works of art. I'm Brother Brett, pastor to the people at Prince of Peace Lutheran Church, Marlton, New Jersey. Today is St. Patrick's Day, March 17, 2021. But today's message will have nothing to do with St. Patrick. Not directly, anyway. It will have to do with all the saints of God, about you and I, how we are experiencing the good news of Jesus Christ. Earlier this year, we heard in the gospel reading on Sunday, Jesus proclaimed, "This is the time of fulfillment. The reign of God is at hand. Change your minds and hearts and believe this good news." This good news that God is present, reigning in power through humility and love. Believe this good news. And so during this Lenten season, we've been unpacking the ways that God is present, that God reigns among us. We began with the first week at looking at FITH, the acronym for feeding, including, forgiving, teaching, and healing. Those ministry ways, activities of Jesus, wherein Jesus brought alive God's presence. And so when we are engaged and see those actions lived out today, feeding, including, forgiving, teaching, and healing, God is present there. And then the next week, we looked at how God is present through the activities of release and freedom and seeing things anew. How this was embodied and emboldened in Jesus' ministry, and how it is a signal of God's presence alive today. And last week, we saw how taking up one's cross, doing that hard thing, so that the other, our neighbor, may have life, was a significant way that Jesus showed forth God's presence, and how God's presence continues to be shown forth today in those activities of taking up that hard thing, so that our neighbor may have life. This week, we're looking at how God is with us in the midst of challenges, in the midst of difficulties. And this is a place where God is present. When our young people explored this topic on Sunday night at our Lenten program, we talked about God and all the powers that God has, like a superhero, even way beyond a superhero. And so they thought a moment, well, could Jesus fly? Could Jesus be invisible? Could Jesus move metal, bend metal? Could Jesus read people's minds? Well, he could. They came to the conclusion. But he didn't. Because Jesus was humble. He didn't regard his equality with God as something to be exploited. We heard this in the reading to the Philippians, the 2nd chapter. We'll hear it again on Palm Sunday. We heard it this fall. That Jesus and God wanted to know exactly what it's like to live a human life. And so God didn't take any God's extraordinary powers and show that off. And to do that, God wanted to know what it was like to be in pain, to experience joy, to experience love, as humans experience love. God wanted to know all of these things in Jesus, right? And so it's a type of eternal, cosmic, forever, compassionate empathy to know what it's like not just to see someone in a ditch or in a difficult place, but to be there, to know what it's like to be rejected, denied, betrayed, ill, suffer, and die. And so in this, Jesus, knowing our experience, is able to be with us in a new and profound way in our own experiences of challenge and difficulty. Unfortunately, our experience of God in these situations is often like hindsight 2020 vision. We might not always recognize it in the midst, but we often, after the fact, recognize, there was God with me in my struggle, in my difficulty. In fact, you'll often hear people who are in 12-step programs talk about how the trouble and difficulty in its huge pain that it caused them and others, that if they look back closely, they do see how God was trying to be with them and rescue them, even though they were not listening or wanting it. But later they saw how indeed God reached out through others, reached out through their own heart, through their own thoughts sometimes, to try to reach them. I remember a time when I was in high school. It was a very difficult time for me, trying to understand who I was and my place in the world and where I would go and whether people would like me and love me and care for me. And I know some of you have heard this story before, but I was feeling alone and abandoned and thought that maybe I was broken. And in fact, after praying one night, when I was in 10th grade, on my knees, climbing into bed, I felt the consolation of God. In the midst of my struggle, I felt God's embrace. I felt it physically, in the most loving and compassionate way. And I heard the words deep in my heart, "You're okay." It raptured, it went down to my core. As you can see, many years later, 35 years later, 36 years later, it's still a story that rocks me to the core. Because it happened not one night, but 3 nights in a row. Even the third night in a different location. But this strong confidence, this grounding voice, "You are mine. You are okay. Just as you are." And so, my friends, I want you to look for those places. It may not be as strong. I've had many, many other experiences, not as profound as this one, but other places where I knew that God was with me in the struggle, usually through other people or things that happened, but that God was with me. And that is a chief way that God chooses to be present with us in our struggle. And it's often in ways we don't always initially see. Might be something we have to see later. I think of the whole manna story about how manna was given so they could survive in the desert, but their first question was, "What is this?" That's what manna means. What is this? What the hell is this? When in fact it is the very sustenance that God provides. And so oftentimes we see this showing up in our time of need in something we might not expect, but is really sustenance. It might not be a joyful sustenance, but it is still sustenance nonetheless. And so, friends, I ask you this week to look and think of a time that was a challenge or a struggle, and when you noticed and experienced God's love. You may not have noticed in the midst, but maybe noticed it after. And that's the thing you're going to put on the bottom of your fabric triangle this week for our giant banner project that we're working on. Right? And so for me, it could be from the story I shared, God's embrace. It's what I'm going to write in the bottom of my triangle of this time. So I invite you to look for those places and celebrate those places where God has come and met you in your struggle and in your challenge, and there be thankful. Friends, it's nice to spend this time with you on this fourth week of Lent. Next week we'll gather for our fifth session of looking at how God is present amongst us. Until then, keep awake, keep noticing. May your hearts and minds continue to change to see those ways that God is present in our midst.